I'm going to give a very abridged version of, well, based on an article I published on this issue. And so I did bring some copies of the article, so there's a whole lot of things that I'm not going to be able to touch on, but if you want, later on I can certainly give you a copy of the article. So what sparked my interest in wolves was living in Juneau. So I was at the University of Alaska Southeast, which is in Juneau, and I lived by the Mendenhall Glacier. And there was a lone wolf who would show up there frequently, and that the locals named him Romeo because he was a lone wolf and he didn't have a pack, and so he constructed a pack from local dogs. And so, you know, I heard earlier, you know, that one slide, you know, the person holding up the dog that was killed by wolves, and that certainly happens. That absolutely happens. But one of the things I think is really important to bear in mind about wolves is and wildlife in general, they're not Cartesian machines, and so there's a lot of variation in individual behaviors. Just like people. So I mean, there's some people you wouldn't trust alone with a kid, for instance, right? And or the same thing with dogs or whatever. There's a lot of variation. So I think that's important to remember is we're talking about unique individuals with unique personalities, and that. So I've been in Wisconsin, I guess, about 24 hours, and already I've picked up on there's the anti-wolf hysteria, and so I do want to talk briefly about that. Is just if you look at the empirical data of wolf attacks in North America, there's very little reason for humans, at least, to fear healthy wolves, so ones that aren't rabid. And the wolves that do tend to be dangerous are the ones that have become habituated, so they're fed by humans, etc. And so with Romeo, this wasn't a relationship unique to myself, is I would see him several times a week, and he would actually join my dogs and I on either in the winter cross-country skiing or day hikes. And that I was saying that you have to look at individual variation. Is he recognized me, recognized the dogs, and he would actually seek us out. And also, if there were humans around he didn't recognize, he could just quickly disappear. And if you look at the variation with my dogs, that the one dog, Seamus, who was the submissive one, he would play with this particular wolf. And again, I wouldn't say, you know, obviously don't send your dogs to play with wolves, they'll probably die. But this was, you know, over a period of years, I got to know this wolf. So Seamus trusted that particular wolf, but there were other wolves in the area. And when he encountered them, he would just freeze. He would refuse to go any further. And then the dog that was the more aggressive one, Isaac, his last great moment is he was 13 years old. He had an artificial hip. And my wife was just walking, and it was a wolf. She saw that wasn't Romeo. And so Isaac got to be the hero and ran as best he could at the wolf, and the wolf retreated. And so Isaac got to be the hero. So my point being is that the dogs can make distinctions among wolves, and the wolf could make distinctions among humans as well. So obviously there's a lot of variation. And so in Juneau, an isolated community, so there's no roads to it, of about 30,000 people, and a lot of people were just really fascinated with having a wolf and being able to have it so accessible. So I'm a horrible photographer. I took that photograph, and I was probably 6 foot away from him. So there were a lot of people who felt like I did, just really looking at it as a very unique opportunity. But then there were a lot of people that were really hostile, and so you'd see these blogs where people talk about like trying to run them over with their cars and the desire to kill them, etc. So there was really never a consensus of where he fit in. And this is one of the last photographs I actually took of him in that same year. Two individuals, Park Myers and Jeffrey Peacock, purposely sought him out and killed him. I mean, and actually gloated over the emotional pain they caused people. And so I know a lot of this from testimony, but also records that were confiscated because they were arrested. The reason why it was illegal to kill him is they killed him with a .22 which it's illegal to kill game with a .22 in Alaska. And so, as a sociologist, so a lot of people just say, well, that they're psychopaths or sociopaths, but that's a pretty shallow analysis. Is that what I see is an extreme manifestation of commonly held sentiments. So, I mean, if you look at that recent killing, you know, with an an African-American church, they invite this gentleman in to worship with him, and he kills him. Obviously, not all racists behave that way. I would say that's an extreme manifestation, though, of widely held sentiments of a certain segment of the population. And so as a sociologist, I'm more interested in looking at putting it into a social context. And so looking at, well, why do many trophy hunters feel this particular way? And I would say, certainly not all hunters, and myself, I grew up hunting. I continue to hunt, so I'm certainly not painting all hunters with this particular brush. Well, one thing that's happened over the past couple of decades is that perceptions of wildlife, but also wolves, particularly wolves, become increasingly positive, and perceptions of hunters have become increasingly negative. And so those of you who hunt, you probably, you know, people probably said negative things to you. Well, that produces what's called out-group anxiety in some people, where they really fear that they're losing status or they're losing economic resources. And historically, this happens all of the time. So the sociologist Beck and Tolnay, they looked at lynchings in the South in the early to mid 20th century. And one of the things they found was as the price of cotton went down, lynchings of African Americans went up, right? So poor economic times, you look for a scapegoat. But the African Americans who were targeted most were ones who had prosperous stores or prosperous farms. Well, because if you think about the incongruence, so, well, quoting directly, in some cases, poor whites reacted out of the frustration to the contradiction between their objective status and the expected benefits of white supremacy. So we're talking about white privilege here, and of course, to have prosperous African Americans, to them, that's a threat to the moral order of the universe. And so lynchings like this are an attempt to restore the moral order. And I know this is a disturbing slide, I apologize, but if you look at, this is essentially a trophy kill, right? So they're posing, they're posing with a corpse, and they're restoring the moral order. This is and this was posted actually on one of these guys' Facebook. So this is a Wyoming wolf kill. And so again, they're posing with the wolf and protecting their hunting rights. And so, again, restoring the moral order. So, exacting revenge on this group. So, one of the places where Myers and Peacock went to brag about killing Romeo, and that was one of the main reasons why they were caught, is they couldn't help but brag about it, was Rayco Gun Shop in Juneau, Alaska. And so I was in there, and that I was actually selling a firearm, so I guess they thought I was okay. But that I said, well, can I take some photographs? And they said, oh, sure. And so this is one of the things that they had in their store. And as I see it, well, if you look at hunters as a group, and again, I'm part of that group. So, but if you look at them as a group, they tend to be middle-aged and older white males. They tend to hold more conservative views than the general population. And if you look at hierarchies in the 21st century, many of them are being radically challenged. And so certainly heterosexual privilege, white privilege, and that if we look at wildlife, I mean, that certainly 60 years ago, Myers and Peacock would have been considered heroes, right? So they see there's something wrong, right? And so you have to punish, you have to punish these people for holding these bizarre values. Imagine, so a couple of slides back, imagine if those individuals who lynched the African-American man back in the 1930s, if they were alive today, it's safe to bet at least a few of them would probably have openly gay descendants. Maybe they'll have descendants who are engaged in interracial dating and marriage, and they would think there's something wrong and these people need to be punished for their transgressions. Well, one of the things to bear in mind is there's no natural way for humans to interact with wolves. And so perceptions of wolves and hunters, they really just vary with the type of economy, and so if we look at traditional hunting cultures, and this applies actually not just to indigenous peoples of North America, but also hunting cultures in Eastern Europe, is that hunters tend to be highly regarded, at least where in the cultures, I realize I'm making a sweeping generalization here, where you have cultures where a significant amount of the food is actually coming from hunting. But it's not just about, in this case, it's not about killing, well, obviously being adept at killing game, but also the status comes from sharing with the community. And this seems to be one thing in common with hunting cultures because it's an unreliable resource. And so with indigenous peoples, they don't tend to have disdain for the 47% or whatever. It's the idea of feeding the community. I know with the Iroquois, so I'm originally from upstate New York, their worst sin was not sharing, and that in the afterlife, people who did that, they would have to rely on their friends to provide them with game meat. So the status was about actually enhancing the general social welfare. Now, wolves were looked at as the ultimate hunters, and of course, like humans, hunting in groups, cooperating, but also distributing the resource within the community. So they're the ultimate hunters, the ultimate warriors, but more importantly, the ultimate community members. And so held in high regard. Now, one of the myths, and I'm sure this is alive and well in Wisconsin, is this talk of a deeply rooted Euro-American hunting culture, that there really is no such thing. That I took this photograph in a Bass Pro Shop in upstate New York. You see in the background a proud New York tradition. If you look at the early European settlers, what they wanted to do is conquer indigenous people, conquer the wilderness, and they didn't value hunting. And so it was to remove. So one tactic was to have just a big group of people get on somebody's farm and just drive all the wildlife, deer, rabbits, bear, whatever, wolves, and just into the center, club it to death, shoot it, just to get rid of it. So that if we look at the, starting in, say, the 1600s, it was that it was to eradicate wildlife and to replace it with domesticated animals. And as I'll get onto later, it wasn't really until the 1950s that hunting peaked in the United States among Euro-Americans. And I know with a lot of the discourse I've heard elsewhere, at least, people will talk about where you will have non-indigenous peoples talking about their deep hunting traditions, which really are more a matter of myth. Looking at one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, so Benjamin Rush, saying that hunting led to idleness. So this idea, no, you should be out plowing the field, the serious business of conquering the wilderness. So it's idle, but also it hardens the heart. But way back then, it was recognized that it's more economical to raise domestic livestock than to hunt. And of course, there's been many studies. If you look at, well, what does a pound of venison cost? For a hunter. I mean, particularly if they're doing things like ATVs and the like. And that if we look at, so with indigenous peoples, they did not tend to be afraid of wolves, and a lot of that division is between what's called indoor cultures and outdoor cultures. So if you have people actually interacting with natural ecosystems, they feel more part of it, they're not afraid of it. But if you're huddled in your cabin, and a lot of early Europeans, they would hear the wolf howl, and of course we've all seen the vampire movies, and this idea that the wolves are coming to get you. Well, wolves don't howl when they're, obviously that'd be a bad hunting tactic to howl when you're trying to find something, right? But no, it's to let other wolves know this is their territory, to communicate with other wolves. but this idea of huddling, and that they're not only a threat to livestock, but they're bloodthirsty and they take delight in killing humans. And of course, we're all familiar with various European myths, and many of these people actually believed in werewolves. And so, if we look at the early Euro-Americans, hunters, they're considered idle, they're frivolous, they should be out, farming or something. Wolves were seen as bloodthirsty, and in many cases they were actually tortured to death in very violent ways. But then wolf killers, that they were considered to be courageous. And so hunting in general wasn't considered a positive thing, but killing the wolves. And so if we look back to European mythology, that on the Mayflower, they had the cross of St. George, and of course that's on the Union Jack as well. He's the patron saint of England. St. George, the dragon slayer, is the dragon was killing livestock, and I believe he kidnapped a princess, but this idea of protecting people, right? Or you think about myths like Beowulf, etc., protecting people from these vicious beasts. And it was similar to having an illustrious military career if you were adept at killing wolves. And so the brave people going out and killing these vicious beasts. Well, that as the invasion of North America continued, what you saw was the decline of actual hunters, and then with the Industrial Revolution beginning about the mid-19th century, the rise, and I think this is a good distinction to make, is the rise of sportsmen. Very different. Right? So I'm going to read this quote from Ed Abbey, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with Ed Abbey. He actually wrote a lot about the Southwest, and he hunted himself. But he's saying, a hunter pursues wild game in order to provide meat for himself, kin, and kith. This is a craft as old as life and perfectly honorable. A sportsman kills for the sake of pleasure, or what he calls sport. This is not honorable. Hunting for sport always appears in overly developed, socially stratified, overly refined cultures. It is a reliable indicator of privilege, hierarchy, and moral decay. So it switches from an activity that benefits the general community to one where it's an elite thing. And that was certainly the case in Europe, and that actually hunting for sport is an import from Europe. Kind of reminds me of Donald Rumsfeld, dismissive of old Europe and America, whatever. But it was Henry William Herbert who first popularized, so we're talking about mid-1800s, sport hunting in the United States. And so it was an elite thing. And one of the more famous hunters, and also, as was mentioned earlier, Roosevelt did some amazing accomplishments as far as conservation, probably single-handedly responsible in some ways for saving the American bison. But he wasn't saying that people should hunt because it was an economical way to get food, but that they could develop a code of ethics, so the fair chase ethic. But also he worried about industrialization, urbanization, men becoming soft, and so that they could benefit from getting out and engaging in vigorous exercise. And also he saw it as a means of preparing men for war. So he actually is saying that the qualities that make a good hunter also make a good soldier. So attaching this masculinity to hunting. But also, and I find this interesting, that in the late 19th century, that when you start to see this trophy hunting, the sport hunting becoming popular, it also coincided, so in the late 19th century, Thorstein Veblen coined the term conspicuous consumption. So done for status, but this is also individual status. And so you see Roosevelt here posing with an African elephant he had killed, and so he's got the gun. So this is conquest, but obviously he's not feeding his family, but it is, this large beast he's killed, he's conquered it, but it's an individual glory. It's not for the general community welfare. So there's a real qualitative difference between traditional indigenous hunting and this sportsman hunting. And so we look at the early 20th century conservationists, that hunters were certainly held in high regard. So getting into the early 20th century, so it was a very masculine thing to do, building character. And so you can certainly enhance your status, and of course there's remnants around still today of getting rare and coveted dead animal parts. And so I can say growing up, many of the people that I knew who hunted whitetail, they didn't like the meat. They would give away the meat, or they would have so much pork fat ground into it that you couldn't tell it was venison, in the sausage. But it was about antlers, right? And we saw earlier, trying to selectively breed for these ridiculous size antlers. But then wolves, and this is before, to be fair to Roosevelt and other conservationists of the time, and even if we look back at Aldo Leopold in the early 20th century, looking at wolves as vermin and to exterminate them. So they really had no idea of the role that apex predators played in ecosystems. But also Roosevelt said fair chase doesn't apply for wolves, to wolves, and so he himself participated in killing wolf pups, which still happens. And so I know in the state of Alaska, occasionally people from Fish and Game will actually pull wolf pups out of their dens and shoot them at close range. And so, the high point of hunting in the United States, and so this is where you see a lot of contemporary hunters, they'll talk about, well, my grandfather hunted and I'm passing on a family tradition. But, well, the Utah folk singer, Utah Phillips, said the most radical idea in America is a long memory, and we tend to have very short memories, right? So my point is it's not some deeply rooted tradition. So you look at after World War II, labor won a bunch of rights. There's the automobile, all these roads built, and so common people had the leisure time and the money to get out and hunt. And so this is really where hunting by Euro-Americans really peaked. And so 25% of men participating in some form of hunting. And a lot of our ideas about history seem to come from just watching television or et cetera. And so some of you will remember Davy Crockett in the 1950s, and then later went on to play a similar role as Daniel Boone, or if not, you can see this in reruns. But I think that, of course, if we look at most Americans, Euro-Americans, that is, they're not descended from mountain men. That was an extreme minority of the population. Most of us are descended from indentured servants, farm laborers, etc., not from buckskin-wearing people out living off the land. But it's more romantic than thinking about, for all intents and purposes, many of our ancestors of Euro-Americans were pretty much slaves coming over here. So in the mid-20th century, so it reaches this high water mark in the 50s, but you've got urbanization. You don't have people doing things like sheep farming, ranching. And so the idea that wolves were a direct threat to people's livelihoods really decreased. But also that once people have a basic level of safety, so many of you are familiar with Maslow's pyramid of needs. So you have the, things like unemployment insurance, Social Security, and that they're able to expand their field of concern to non-human animals. So starting to see wildlife and more. Did you say 5 minutes? Okay, I'll step it up. Sorry. Believe me, you're getting the condensed version. Okay, so you see this decline in hunting. So since then, it's been dropping radically. And so in 2006, about 10% of men, 1% of women, but also with younger people, the dramatic decline. And so perceptions of trophy hunters have become increasingly negative. Perceptions of wolves have become increasingly positive. And so this outgroup anxiety. So one of the things that's common, so I apologize for this next slide in advance, by the way, but this idea, if you object to any form of animal killing, that you're out of touch with nature, you're effeminate, right? And so this is rather mild language coming from Sarah Palin, speaking to Safari Club International. This will give you a better idea. And I apologize, but I think it's good to show the way people actually speak. And so this is an encounter between a reporter who had written an article, mentioned this fellow Polson in it. And so you see it's the theme, you're not masculine, I'm basically going to hurt you. So this was another photograph I took in Rayco gun shop. So shoot straight, kill clean, apologize to no one. Okay? Well, this was the climate that Romeo emerged in. Now, one of the things I heard earlier is about, and I think there's probably a difference in size between the Alaskan wolves in general and maybe wolves in the Midwest. Romeo was a big wolf, and so he was at least 130 pounds. And so you see in the foreground that black thing, that's my dog Seamus's head. He was 75 pounds. Give you an idea of the size difference, and also how comfortable I got to feel with this particular wolf. And again, I don't do this at home, and that's just Seamus and Romeo running around a Mendenhall Lake. I mean, they loved each other, and this I think really captures that. So Joost Bakker took that photograph, and I think that, you know, a lot of people took delight in having him there, but you could see as a threat if you're trying to demonize wolves, and also if you want to attain status by killing wolves, and you've got these people who really love the wolf, you can see this kind of, right, where, and of course it's the inversion. Well, no, the wolf killer becomes the brutal one. Well, one of the things is he was turned in by this gentleman, Michael Lohman, who just wrote down what he was saying. He was a co-worker, and I should note that Lohman himself is a hunter and actually a former Navy SEAL, and this guy Peacock said, I'll kill you if you tell anyone, and somehow Lohman wasn't particularly intimidated by that threat. But so you get in, so this idea, if you just read that quickly, the contempt for the people, but also skinning the carcass and holding up the bloody carcass, this mutilation, right? This real hatred of the wolf and the people who cared. And when you see this redistribution of positive identities, and so Nick Jans, and Jans is a hunter as well, but so this was, the 2014 was after Romeo was killed, but several books were written about this wolf, and a lot of money was made. The local coffee company named a coffee after the wolf, and then I attended. I think this is the first memorial ever for a wild wolf, and we chipped in and got a plaque. It's out there. But this idea of this elevated status, and many people looking at it as a friend, you can see with some of these trophy hunters just looking at what is wrong. You people need to be punished. This wolf needs to be punished. And so, just trying to wrap it up a bit, just say that it's a false dichotomy, the hunter, anti-hunter. As I mentioned, I hunt, Nick Jans, Vic Van Ballenberg. These are the people who are actually some of the biggest advocates for wolves in Alaska. But ultimately, also, he was turned in by a hunter who didn't agree with it. And so I'm going to take the time to read this quote by Aldo Leopold, which is appropriate since we're in Baraboo. The disquieting thing in the modern picture is the trophy hunter who never grows up, in whom the capacity for isolation, perception, and husbandry is undeveloped or perhaps lost. To enjoy, he must possess, invade, appropriate. Hence, the wilderness he cannot personally see has no value to him. Is my share of Alaska worthless to me because I shall never go there? And so, if we look at this distinction between the hunter, and so that's Leopold, and many of you are familiar with Leopold, and so he would make his own bows. And if you read, you know, his essays about hunting, in many cases he got nothing. It didn't kill anything, but had a great time. And that's Park Myers on the right. And that if you look at that hunt, so that was done. It was an illegal bear baiting station. So the idea was to get something as easily as possible. So honey and stale hot dog buns. So pretty easy way to kill a bear, but also you'll notice that's the fall. And so Juneau is right on the coast. You don't have to, and I doubt this bear was eaten because they've been eating salmon and they're not particularly good to eat. And so it was all about killing for the sake of killing, but also very common pose is to put the weapon over the animal, so he's conquered this particular animal. And so I think it's important to make that distinction between hunters who have ethics, who appreciate ecological diversity, and then there are people who are what Leopold referred to, they're frozen in the hog sticking stage of hunting. They just want to kill something. Okay, thank you.
I guess the microphone. Does anyone have any questions? We've got about 10 minutes for questions.
I really appreciated your comment about the hunter versus the anti-hunter as a false dichotomy. Yeah. I too have observed that, and I think we have to really focus on that since there are so many traditional, mainstream, however you want to call it, principled hunters who have a problem with many of the hunting practices that you've described. Something that I'm curious about that I think you probably have chewed on from a scientific or sociological perspective is these folks who, the trophy hunters, who want the easiest, fastest approach to the killing, what is that they tell themselves that makes them feel proud or victorious? What do you, how do they rationalize that as some heroic or impressive or deed to brag about? You can tell from my tone that I'm wondering it in a way that doubts it, but I'm curious what you have observed in terms of how their self-rhetoric can rationalize it.
Yeah, I think a lot of time, and personally I have trouble understanding it, but a lot of times wild game, I mean even deer are sometimes portrayed as aggressive, right? And it's a you or them, or I've talked to people who've killed bear, it's, I guess, the mythology, and if you really are invested in believing that sort of thing, I guess the largest thing I ever killed was a buffalo, and it certainly wasn't a heroic act. I mean, if I used a machete, that would be heroic, but with a modern rifle, it's really not much of a contest. But I do know the rhetoric is a lot of times it's dangerous. The other thing, and this is really different, is what Marx referred to as artificial differences created by money. A lot of modern hunting, the biggest factor involved is how much money do you have. And so one thing interesting is killing Alaskan brown bear, which is a big trophy animal. Out-of-state hunters are more successful because they can hire guides, float planes, all of this. Or other mention was made of game farms. I know with Safari Club International, they have this point system. And you can actually get points for going to a game farm and essentially a canned kill. And so I don't know how exactly it's seen as I don't as a heroic activity, but yeah, there are a lot of people convinced of it. Absolutely.
So I have a question. If we're talking about money, that goes directly to this, because if you look at the so-called canned hunts, and if we're really about trying to generate enterprise, money, wealth, right, prosperity, sustainability, right? In my province, the average number of days to get an elk is 250 hunter days to get an elk.
Right.
This is for it's not an easy thing to do.
Right.
The amount of equipment, the amount of money that you spend to do that is enormous. So you had a picture of Bass Pro. Recently, Johnny Morris, the owner of Bass Pro, wrote a letter to try to keep chronic wasting disease out of Missouri. And we're hoping that by appealing to some of the enterprise side of the wildlife economy that I talked about earlier, that we might be able to have people understand that where these canned hunts, people very often don't even have to take their own rifle. They require no equipment. It's over in a matter of hours,
right?
Right? And then the question is, do they want another one? And if they want another one, do they want another one after that? This is called diminishing marginal utility in economics. And what we find is that the elite, fake, canned hunt, capital amusement, call it what you want, Bambi in a barrel, is nowhere near economic. It's not sustainable. It's the single greatest threat to the ecosystem that we have. So I don't know. I really appreciate the distinction between the so-called sportsman and the hunter. Right. I think that's vital.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up actually elk. That personally, that's my favorite animal to hunt, and I think anyone who would go for a canned hunt is missing the point, is that they're such a social, vocal animal that most of my elk hunts, I don't shoot an elk, but I mean, having them close in enough where you can see their nostrils when they're breathing, and it's just that So what if somebody's out 100? Those are 180 good days, or how many you said. There's those type of hunters. And actually, last spring I interviewed Doug Smith, who's the wildlife biologist in charge of wolf introduction. He says the same thing about his elk hunts. He doesn't get, a lot of times it's maybe every third year, or Vic Van Ballenberg actually taught, so he's an Alaskan biologist, talked about carrying out a moose, but having wolves eat some of the carcass while he was away, and he said to hear them howl was worth losing 20 pounds of meat, to hunt in intact ecosystems. And that there are some hunters who like hunting in areas where there are wolves because the game's more alert, right? Rather than having these docile things. And so it's a subsection within hunting. But with the other, I think to me, it's really capitalist culture, the sense of entitlement. It's almost like going to if I have the money, I should be able to go and buy this. And I feel, well, just go buy a Hummer if you need to. Buy something to enhance your status. There's other ways of doing it. No, I see it as equivalent because there's not skill involved at all.
Alex, I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
Can you, just because we're running short on time and I think this is an important issue,
Yeah.
can you talk to how, sociologically, how the difference in language achieves different results maybe when, as you say, like the out-group anxiety, how they frame things, and how do we maybe work within the frame of their language? So, for example, harvest,
Right.
and those kind of things that soften some of these sportsman practices. If you could just speak onto those different language things.
Yeah, and I think that's important, is to not use, and there are euphemisms utilized, and so management is a great one. And so management, management could be dragging wolf pups from the den and killing them. And I think it's important to use, to really use direct language like that, but that also to be honest about what people are doing, why they are doing it. And so that one of the things that takes place in Alaska is this idea, well, people need to do this to feed their families. Well, that one of the things I said to the commissioner of game, who actually got canned for poaching, but anyhow, I was on the board of the Alaska Wildlife Alliance, and Corey Rossi, I met with him, and I said, why don't you put me on the cover of one of your glossy brochures? Because what they purported to be doing is protecting indigenous peoples. And I said, no, I'm representative of the Alaskan hunter. I'm a middle-aged, middle-class urban guy who hunts because I enjoy it. And of course, I said, if you're really concerned about indigenous people, why do you oppose having an indigenous preference? Why can people from Connecticut go up into traditional lands and hunt? This sort of thing. So there's obviously a lot of contradictions and holes in the rhetoric, but I think one of the biggest things for most of the population, hunting is not a vital thing. So if I don't get an elk this year, my family's not going to starve to death. But if wolves don't get an elk, well, yeah, their family is going to starve to death. And so we start looking at vital versus non-vital interests.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to go way in the back. Can you keep your hand up? Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you for a fascinating talk, especially the historical perspective. That was extremely interesting. The split between a hunter versus sportsman is something that I think a lot of us see here in Wisconsin, probably nationwide. And my question to you is what I've found is that the sportsmen have been extremely successful at sort of gathering the wagons, at basically making the argument that any kind of suggestion about changing in hunting practices, any kind of boundaries, limits, or changes is an attack on all hunting itself.
Right.
And so it's hard. So it's hard to have discussions with one group versus the other because there's always a kind of a circling of the wagons, and the sportsmen have used fear so effectively. Do you have any thoughts about how to handle moving forward that kind of situation?
Yeah, I mean, and so it sounds like what they're using here, the incrementalist argument or slippery slope argument. So if anything's changed, then somebody's going to come for their guns and there'll be no more hunting. And that that obviously, I don't know that much about, I know there's, deer hunting is very popular here in Wisconsin, but that obviously, my assumption is that to a certain extent, human hunting is necessary here of deer in particular, is that certainly natural predators are much better at enhancing ecological diversity, et cetera. But I'm assuming things like Lyme disease, et cetera, is it's necessary to have people out there. And the other thing, I think needs to be made clear to hunters. I would say, as far as think about the lunch we had, I assume that wasn't wild game. If you look at factory farming versus hunting, I would say that certainly hunters have the moral high ground when it comes to being honest about where their meat comes from and actually killing something in a humane way, at least in most cases. But one of the things I could say, we did when I was on the board of the last Wildlife Alliance, we wrote a pro-hunting statement. We said, this is the type of hunting we support, right? So we were very clear, but that we didn't support trophy hunting, and that we certainly supported it within ecological limits. So I think, to be blatant, it sounds like most of you probably support hunting in one form or the other.
Sorry, we're out of time.
Okay, sorry. Oh yeah, and I have copies of, there's a whole lot I didn't cover, so I do have some copies of the article if you want.
Thank you. I know there's so much we could talk about. It feels short on time. We wanted to get you as much information as we could.